Inaugural drama. Trump is living up to his threats and promises. Republican Donald Trump has been sworn in as the 47th president of the US after his decisive victory in the November 24 election. He marked the start of his second innings with a slew of executive orders, actions, and directives that set the tenor of his administration's policy agenda over the 4 years. Significant among these are nearly 1,600 pardons issued to those prosecuted for their role in the riot at the US Capitol in 2021, the US's exit from the Paris Climate Agreement and World Health Organization, the ending of birthright citizenship protected under the US Constitution's 14th Amendment for children of undocumented migrants and those on temporary visas, a proposed 100% tariff on BRICS nations, both of which could impact Indians considerably, and 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico from February 1. A declaration of national emergency on the US's southern border with Mexico, and reversing 78 executive orders and memoranda of his predecessor, Joe Biden, striking optics of Trump's swearing in, was the positioning of tech bosses Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Sundar Pichai, Mark Zuckerberg, prompting speculation whether the incoming administration would have shades of de facto oligarchy. And Mr. Musk, who is heading the new government efforts to reduce waste and efficiencies, giving a crowd what appeared to resemble a Nazi salute. As it stands, however, some, if not most, uh, of these executive orders will face legal challenges. The attempted reading down of the 14th Amendment has already been challenged in court. The note that second Trump administration has struck in terms of his policy agenda appears to be innately hostile to the progressive agenda of the Democrats to a considerable extent. That is to be expected as the two parties diverge significantly on matters such as economy, immigration, and reproductive rights. Yet previous Republican governments have often sought to build bridges with Democratic colleagues in Congress and at a state level to find bipartisan consensus in key policy areas rather than risk deadlock and internecine conflicts over policy design and resource allocation. In this stance, however, the federal government trifecta and sympathetic Supreme Court stacked with conservatives might mean that Trump team needs to rely even less on support from across the aisle than it did during the Trump first term. Further, Mr. Trump appears to be emboldened by the breadth of his election victory to allow unconventional, even bizarre policy priorities to enter the proposed agenda, including ideas such as takeover of the Panama Canal, the de-recognition of transgender rights, threatening Denmark with a plan to take over Greenland, and the prospect of travel bans for certain countries. Perhaps America is getting what it voted for. The price of success. Kerala's rising maternal mortality ratio is not yet a cause of concern. There can be too much of a good thing. After all, the demographic transition that Kerala has heralded in the country has now delivered a sucker punch to the state, with its maternal mortality ratio climbing. Kerala led the shift to the phase of low fertility and low mortality in India and got further first. As the fertility level dropped, the number of births came down, thereby skewing the best maternal mortality rate, calculated as the number of deaths for every 1 lakh live births of the country in Kerala. The state led the demographic transition by achieving the total replacement level fertility rate in 1987-88, and the other southern states followed in mid 2000s. A TFR of 2.1 is considered the replacement level, indicating the number of children a woman must have in order for the society to maintain its size across generations. Below this level, the population size falls. In fact, this has led to moments of anxiety politically for the southern states that feel that with their sub replacement level fertility rates, they will have a disadvantage when it comes to the proposed delimitation exercise of Lok Sabha seats based on population figures. In theory, Demographic transition occurs when a historical shift happens from high birth rates and high death rates to low birth rates and death rates, aided by the advancement in education, economic development, and technology. Such a transition is said to have occurred in most parts of the world, allowing the world to stabilize from an unprecedented growth forecast by Malthus and then move on to reduce population growth and birth rates. The theory posits four stages, moving from stable population to a rapid population growth, leveling out, and finally decline. The nations that have reached there, including South Korea, are struggling to revive population growth, and even incentivizing childbearing does not seem to have an intended effect as fertility rate continues to drop. While it is impossible to stop a demographic transition in its tracks, government must prepare for the trial of consequences that it will bring in the wake. There will be far reaching economic and societal consequences as the proportion of working age population comes down and aged population increases, placing an inordinate burden on the resources of nations. It is therefore important to strengthen public finances and social support systems in preparation for a growing elderly population. Healthcare financing will have to be improved and policies that support equal participation in household chores must be prioritized. Time to seize the promise of the US India nuclear deal. 16 years ago, this writer and other organizers of the Coalition of Partnerships with India rejoiced at the final approval of the United States India civil nuclear deal through the US Congress. The long struggle for the passage of the necessary US legislation began in 2005, and it was only late 2008 that the coalition succeeded in working with George W. Bush administration and US Congress leaders to make the deal legal under US law. The Coalition for Partnership with India was loose association of business, Indian Americans, and academics that supported US approval of the deal in the face of fierce opposition that stipulated that the deal would promote the proliferation of nuclear weapons. As a consultant to the US India Business Council, this writer was privileged to recruit and act as a liaison among the coalition components, plan strategy, and advocate before the Congress. The US India civil nuclear deal was a watershed moment and opened a whole new era in defense and strategic cooperation for the two democracies that had become estranged during the Cold War. Without the trust is endangered by the willingness to cooperate in dealing with the most powerful and potentially most destructive technology ever seen, the present level of US India interaction on the defense purchases and manufacturing, military exercises, and technology transfer, intelligence sharing, and crisis management would never have occurred. And yet, energy and commercial promises of US India deal have never been fulfilled. Those of us who supported and advocated for the deal envisaged the augmentation of the Indian civil nuclear sector with many plants being built using US equipment, technology, and allied services. Employment would be created both in US and India. More electricity would be generated by plants to fuel Indian industry and benefit the average Indian. The energy would not generate greenhouse gases and help wean India away from over-reliance on climate-changing and often toxic fossil fuels. Even though US President Barack Obama announced in 2016 that Westinghouse would build six new nuclear plants in India, and this has not happened yet. Jake Sullivan, in his last trip to India as US President Joe Biden's National Security Advisor, announced the United States is now finalizing necessary steps to remove long-standing regulations that have prevented civil nuclear deal cooperation between India's leading nuclear entities and US companies. The US India civil nuclear deal was a watershed moment and opened a whole new era in defense and strategic cooperation. Without the trust endangered by the willingness to cooperate in dealing with most powerful and potentially most destructive technology ever seen, and yet the energy and commercial promises of US India deal have never been fulfilled. Those of us who supported and advocated for the deal envisaged the augmentation of India's civil nuclear deal with many plants being built using US equipment, technology, and allied services. Employment would be created both in US and India. More electricity would be generated by plants to fuel Indian industry and benefit the average Indian. This energy would not generate greenhouse gases and help wean India away from over reliance on climate change and often toxic fossil fuels. The United States is now finalizing the necessary steps to remove long-standing regulations that prevented civil nuclear cooperation between India's leading nuclear entities and US companies. Will this development be a mechanism that breaks the logjam that has prevented US-India deal from fulfilling its true potential? If it were so simple. At the conclusion of the civil nuclear deal in 2008, there were approximately 200 Indian entities and the so-called entity list kept by the US Department of Commerce. In general terms, US companies are prohibited from doing businesses with companies on the list unless a special license is granted. In practice, such licenses are seldom granted. After the US India civil nuclear deal, all but a handful of Indian companies dealing with nuclear matters were removed from the list. This was one of the benefits of the deal. Among those remaining were those that mainly involved in research and development and thought to involve the risk of nuclear technology leakage into military uses and other security uses, including leakage to Russia and other adversaries of the US. Mr. Sullivan, in his speech in New Delhi, made oblique reference to this concern when he said, as we see more and more technologies diverted to unfriendly actors, the United States and India will also need to ensure that the valuable dual use technologies don't fall into the wrong hands. This means aligning our export control systems. Apparently, the Biden administration decided that few remaining Indian nuclear entities on the US entity list no longer present the kind of security concerns that landed them on the list in the first place. These were all well and good and can be considered progress, although it remains to be seen whether the security and foreign policies under Trump will agree with that assessment. However, this is not the heart of the problem preventing US India civil nuclear deal from reaching its full potential, the liability risk issue. In 2010, India enacted the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act. In 2010, India enacted the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act. Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act 2010. Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act. This act was fueled in Parliament by those who had lost the attempt to block the deal and then their anti-foreigner rhetoric, including invocation of the famous Bhopal Union Carbide tragedy. The result was India departing from international civil nuclear liability norms and placing major liability obligations not on operators of the civil facility but on suppliers. Neither of the US suppliers, GE and Westinghouse, was willing to assume these liability risks, and neither the US nor India was willing at the time to step in to ameliorate these liability concerns. The Indian government did attempt later to provide some relief from liability risk in conjunction with the resumption of Russian participation in the Indian civil nuclear expansion. Though India's public sector general insurance corporation and four other government companies, a 20-year insurance premium will be charged to cover suppliers' liability for an accident, the Russian accepted the risk amelioration in the large part because their overseas civil nuclear entities are government owned, will have a defense of sovereign immunity, and in any case will be protected by the Russian government from the liability that might otherwise put them out of business. And the Russians saw their increased participation in the Indian civil nuclear development as bearing significant geopolitical dividends. The Russians are now moving forward with India on civil nuclear expansion. The US companies have been unwilling so far to accept this insurance amelioration. Thus, the Trump administration will have to find means to cut Gordon Gordian coat of liability before there will be significant US company involvement in the Indian civil nuclear expansion. There are other significant barriers to full involvement of US companies in civil nuclear expansion that have arisen since 2008 conclusion of the US-India civil nuclear deal. Civil nuclear technology has evolved rapidly. For US companies to be fully involved, they must show that they can offer the latest technology. Most importantly, this technology and its implementing equipment must be offered at a reasonable price that will not increase electricity cost to the Indian consumer. Indian civil nuclear officials are acutely aware of the disastrous cost overruns that have doomed the latest civil nuclear facilities in the US and left ratepayers to shoulder unwelcome costs without improvements in either quality or quantity. All these challenges limit the full fruition of the US India civil nuclear deal, but they cannot be met by US companies acting alone. The Trump administration can work with Indian and US nuclear companies on not just on regulatory issues but also those involving liability, technology, and cost as well. The hour is late, but the benefits to seizing the full promise of the US India nuclear deal will be tremendous. Trump 2.0 as a disruptor of the global legal order. Donald Trump's second term as President of the United States marked the start of new Trumpian era, defined by his leadership. Foreign policy experts expect that Mr. Trump will continue to embody the image of a disruptor. The international legal order is expected to experience substantial changes. As the leading global power of our time, the US has always maintained a complicated relationship with international law. The US has played a vital role in establishing many key institutions and frameworks within international law, as well as shaping their norms, priorities, and agendas to align with universal American interest. This influence is evident across various areas of international law, including climate change law, space law, human rights law, and trade and investment law. At the same time, America has often followed the policy of exceptionalism, that is, an attitude of being distinct and thus an exception to the law that binds all other nations. Thus, the US has been criticized for violating or sidelining the same norms and institutions of the international law that it helped to create and expects other countries to follow. While this has been the case for many American presidencies, Trump presidency took it to the completely different level among waging a war on the international law. Elected with the slogan of America First, Mr. Trump's first term reflected what international law scholars Ona Hathaway and Scott Shapiro call a sovereigntist view of international law, which often misconceives entering into multilateral treaties as putting unacceptable limits on sovereign authority. Mr. Trump's first term was marked by skepticism towards multilateralism and a preference for bilateralism, which is usually the case of emerging revisionist powers but strange for the incumbent superpower. Accordingly, the Trump administration in June 17 famously walked away from the Paris Agreement in 27. Paris Agreement on climate change. Washington also reneged on a clean nuclear treaty with Russia and nuclear deal with Iran. Mr. Trump also posed major challenges to the international trade regime by using tariffs and other protectionist measures, including called allied countries. He continued blocking appointments to the WTO dispute settlement appellate body, which ultimately led to the organ becoming dysfunctional. Under his presidency, the US withdrew from the Trans Pacific Partnership Agreement that the Obama administration had so assiduously crafted and put an end to the North American Free Trade Agreement (NAFTA) and negotiating a few and put an end to the North Atlantic American Free Trade Agreement and negotiating few trade agreement. Additionally, during the first term, the US withdrew from several international institutions such as UNESCO, attempted to withdraw from WHO, and threatened to withdrawal from WTO. Mr. Trump's return to the White House could accelerate the weakening of the normative authority of multilateral institutions. While US joined many of multilateral institutions under the Biden administration, it might again disengage from them. In fact, within hours of this inauguration, he reportedly signed executive orders initiating US withdrawal from WHO and Paris Agreement. Mr. Trump's announcement announced fresh plans to pursue unilateralism, raising tariffs and even if it triggers a trade war and violates WHO rules. He has already announced that he may impose a 25% tariff on imports from Mexico and Canada. His belligerent onslaught on the Washington Consensus based international trade and investment law model will continue unabated. Any hopes for Global South of reviving the WTO's dysfunctional appellate body should be abandoned, while some hoped that Mr. Trump's policies may translate into renewed US isolationism and less interventionism. His recent statement belies such hopes. His plans to annex Greenland and the Panama Canal, refusing to rule out coercive methods to do so, and to include Canada in the 51st state of the US as reminiscent of the 18th and 19th century era of great powers acquiring sovereign territories through conquest and gunboat diplomacy in the post-UN Charter, which considers prohibition of using force and self-determination as central tenets. Such ambitions may embolden other revisionist states such as China and Russia to embark on similar quest for obtaining territory. As scholars such as Marco Melanchoic have pointed out, even if Trump ultimately does not use force, these statements potentially violate the norm of non-intervention under Article 2, Clause 7 of UN Charter, further challenging the international order. The statement made by his allies such as Elon Musk, who is part of Trump administration, commenting on the internal policies and laws of allied countries such as UK and Germany, have also irked many and could be construed as unacceptable intervention. His plans to accept annex Greenland and Panama Canal, refusing to rule out any coercive methods to do so, and include Canada as the 51st state of the US, are reminiscent of the 18th-19th century era of great powers acquiring sovereign territories through conquest and gunboat diplomacy. Other nations and the legal order. International lawyer Harold Coe has pointed out that participants involved in transnational legal process, including many officials with the US itself, were able to blunt many of Mr. Trump's policies in the first term, particularly those affecting international law. However, with Mr. Trump's renewed majority and control over both the Senate and the House, it is more likely that he will be able to push forward his policies more effectively. In that case, other countries must cooperate to preserve the international legal order. The world has been changing for the while. The world has been changing for the while. One of the things one learns as a historian and as a traveler is that places change. I was in Chennai for the wonderful Lit for Life festival alongside a host of stellar thinkers and speakers, and marveled at the transformation of the city. I do not mean the airport that has been upgraded since the I last came to Tamil Nadu, or the infrastructure that is changing daily for the Chennai's inhabitants. Environmental change. In 2019, Chennai declared day zero when the water ran out. Many recognized that water management needed to be overhauled. Some questioned the viability of a city that was unable to meet such basic needs. 5 years on, the story could not be more different. Unseasonal and catastrophic storms, torrential rains left the city uninundated. People were driven out of their homes. People were driven out of their homes, and not because of too little water but too much. We are living through a major environmental reorganization, and we can learn from previous episodes of disruption and change. The difficulty, as shown so clearly by the case of Chennai, is that it is not enough to prepare for droughts or for deluge, but to prepare for both. Such lessons are particularly important today because of the scale of climatic shifts that are taking place. No human has ever lived in such a warm world, nor one with such high concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Half of the fossil fuels have been burned by humans since Sachin Tendulkar made his test debut for India. That does not feel very long ago to me. Environmental change is all the more challenging because it is just one set of revolutions that are transforming the world around us. New technologies are giving us new powers to communicate and share with each other, but also to rile, antagonize, and threaten, helping polarize political discussion. the return of Trump. Ironically, while political leaders in some countries may think that they are giving people what they want, but the evidence suggests otherwise. In 2024, most people cast their votes at the ballot box around the world than in any year in history. While each country has its own story, one common trend was that political parties that were in power either found it almost impossible to remain in office and were voted out and had their majority sharply reduced. There are many explanations to why, but the most persuasive would seem to be that voters can see the world changing in front of their eyes and are hungry for ideas on how to best embrace the opportunities and how to cope with the disruptions of the modern age. That is the best summed by the return of Donald Trump to power, something that has been accompanied by question marks not just about the role of US in global affairs but of its long-term role as stabilizing force. Mr. Trump's well-publicized comments about buying Greenland, taking the Panama Canal, or using economic force to compel Canada to join the US to, can perhaps be taken with a pinch of salt, but India's ever astute Minister of External Affairs S. Jaishankar is right to note that Mr. Trump's return may have profound consequences for the global order. Indeed, added Mr. Jaishankar, we may well be on the cusp of a new era. Just look then at the case of the TikTok. So on Sunday, it began to shut down following outgoing President Joe Biden's decision that the Chinese company posed a threat to US national security. With Mr. Trump's anti China rhetoric, one might have expected this to be confirmed. Instead, he intervened to keep the company alive, at least for now. That fits exactly with Mr. Trump's sweet spot for being pragmatic and open to business, though it also shows his opportunism. TikTok would make a nice thank you present for Elon Musk for his crucial support during the election, one that has further advantage of keeping the Musk busy. That Mr. Trump wrote in to save Chinese business rather than destroy is instructive about how he thinks. As for India, things look more complicated. The world looks different from when we saw the Howdy Modi and Namaste Trump events of 2019 and 2020. For one, it will be harder for Delhi to play the game of multiple alignments, of being a leading part of both BRICS and the Quad, of getting oil from sanctioned entities, of buying US made Apache helicopters but also Russian 400 air defense systems. India has made a virtue of trying to keep all options open. That will come under pressure in the next 4 years, as Mr. Trump is the sort of leader who does not want his friends to have other friends. The winds of change are blowing. In other words, Mr. Trump took office hours after the first proper breakthrough in West Asia, with many hoping that the devastation of Palestine is now finally over. He faces an Iran that is weaker and more exposed than perhaps at any time in the last 40 years, Russia that has enfeebled itself economically, culturally, and militarily through the invasion of Ukraine, and China, whose outlook on global affairs has moved substantially in the last decade. Of all of Mr. Trump's qualities, the most important that he is lucky with his timing. If you are a historian, we are not so much on the cusp of a new era, but have been in some of the time. And that, of course, is what change is all about, invisible, unnoticed, and unremarkable. Luckily, historians can tell you a thing or two about that. Sweet wins for turmeric farmers. The National Turmeric Board needs adequate funds to fulfill its objective. This year's Sankranti was particularly sweet for the turmeric farmers in Telangana, as their nearly 2 decade long demand for a national turmeric board headquartered in Nizamabad became a reality when Union Minister of Commerce and Industry inaugurated it on the day of festival. Turmeric is widely cultivated in Nizamabad and parts of northern Telangana along the Godavari River. Last year, the turmeric was sold in Nizamabad in agricultural market between 15,000 and 18,000 per quintal. Now it is priced at 10,000 per quintal. According to the Union government, 3.5 lakh 3 lakh hectares were under cultivation in India, which produced 10 lakh tons of the crop. India accounts for 70% of global commercial turmeric production, with Telangana playing a key role in the cultivation. 2023-4 1.62 lakh tons of turmeric and turmeric products valued at 226.5 million were exported. Undocumented migrants in US vital workforce, low criminality. United States President Donald Trump introduced sweeping changes immediately after being sworn in, which could have lasting impact on millions of undocumented militant migrants in the US and hundreds of thousands of people seeking entry at the Trump country's border. Mr. Trump pledged to deport millions and millions of criminal aliens, referring to undocumented migrants living in the country. While Mr. Trump has frequently claimed that former President Joe Biden allowed 15-20 million illegal immigrants into the country, official figures estimate that there are around 11 million. Other estimates suggest that there are 13 to 14 million illegal immigrants. But none of these comes close as Mr. Trump's assertions. Around 21 lakh Indians were included in these estimates. While Trump has frequently claimed that former President Joe Biden allowed 15-20 million illegal immigrants, official figures suggest the estimate that there are around 11 million. Other estimates suggest that there are 13 to 14 million illegal immigrants. None of them comes close to Mr. Trump's assertions. Around 2.1 lakh Indians were included in these estimates as of 2022. Nearly 80% of estimated 11 million undocumented migrants currently in the US arrived before 2010. Chart 2 shows that 1.5 million of them entered decades ago between 1980 and 1990. Reports state that Mr. Trump had also dismissed top immigration court officials who are responsible for deciding who gets asylum and who does not. There are more than 3 million cases pending in immigration courts. In addition, Mr. Trump has shut down the mobile app CBP One, the sole platform for requesting asylum in the US. Chart 3 shows that in just over a year, the backlog in immigration courts increased from 2.4 million to 3.5 million. Notably, the number of Indians attempting to enter the US illegally has surged in recent years. A decade ago, US border authorities stopped more than 1,500 Indian illegal migrants. Moreover, a bill passed by the Senate empowers officials to detain and even deport undocumented migrants who are arrested or charged with even non-violent petty crimes such as shoplifting. Mr. Trump has blamed migrants for fueling violent crime in the country, but data show that violent offending rate of undocumented migrants is significantly lower than those of US born citizens. Chart 4 presents the rate of violent crimes committed in Texas between 2012 and 2018 by US born citizens documented immigrants and undocumented immigrants. The rate of violent crimes committed by undocumented migrants was half than those of committed by US born citizens. A significant majority of undocumented migrants contribute to US workforce, particularly in construction and agriculture. With discussions on mass deportation gaining momentum, business owners in these sectors are finding viable alternatives. A 2018 study by the Center of Migration Studies of New York estimated that 5.5 million undocumented migrants are part of the US workforce. The recent essential services such as landscaping, laundry, auto repair, and safety and sanitation would also face several severe disruptions. The recent changes aim to deport undocumented migrants without a clear understanding of their numbers. Many have lived in the US for decades, contribute significantly to essential services, and lead lives with relatively lower levels of criminal activity. News in numbers: India's national sex ratio at birth in 23-24 9:30. The government will organize celebrations to commemorate the 10th anniversary of Beti Bachao Beti Padhao initiative. Beginning Wednesday, the celebrations will continue till March 8. India's 2030 target for renewable energy production 500 gigawatt. The government is committed to increase the production of renewable energy in the country by 2030 and meet 50% of the energy requirement from renewable sources. $62 million European Union's aid package for Lebanon armed forces. Number of fatalities in Sky Resort fire, Americans freed in Afghanistan in prestigious change. What do the draft data protection rules state? With major tech companies such as Meta, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon, will major companies be affected by the rules on data localization? How does Rule 22 augment Section 36 of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023? Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023. Will the new rules compromise end-to-end encryption of messages? The Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology on January 3, 2025 released draft rules for implementing Digital Personal Data Protection Act 23, 16 months after law was notified in 23. The Union government is currently soliciting feedback on the draft rules through a fiduciary framework that effectively precludes both public disclosure and the submission of counter comments. The draft rules, coupled with the existing legislation, are inadequate for establishing a comprehensive data privacy framework. Moreover, the government should consider submitting the rules to a parliamentary standing committee for scrutiny. What is the data localization mandate? The draft rules introduce a data localization mandate that extends beyond the original scope of legislation. Data localization refers to measures that restrict the flow of data within a jurisdiction's border. Data localization refers to measures that restrict the flow of data within jurisdictions' borders. While the DPDP Act permits the government to limit personal data transfers, it confines such restriction to specific notified countries. In contrast, the rules propose the creation of government-appointed committee. Rules propose the creation of government-appointed committee to define which classes of data cannot be exported from India. This mandate will apply to significant data fiduciaries as it is designated by the government based on the volume and sensitivity of the personal data they process. Major tech companies such as Meta, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon are expected to fall within this classification. The localization provision likely stems from the challenges law enforcement agencies face in accessing cross-border data during investigation. In 2018, RBI implemented a similar mandate, requiring payment data operators to localize the data within the country. Currently, financial payment and insurance data must be stored domestically, with copies of payment data allowed overseas solely to facilitate international transactions. However, the government has clarified that the proposed committee is envisioned as a central body that will collaborate with other ministries and sectoral regulations to ensure the effective implementation of local data storage without disrupting industry operations. This approach could also help prevent ad hoc data localization mandates from government departments working in silos. Broad, Minis- Union Minister for Information and Broadcasting Ashwini Vaishnaw earlier told media reporters that government plans Government plans to provide industry with a 2-year timeline to establish necessary systems for compliance, according to Aparajita Bhartiya, founder of partner at TQH Consulting, which advises tech companies on compliance with Indian laws. Data localization mandates could present substantial operational challenges for both tech companies and startups. It is extremely difficult for companies to segment different sets of data and determine the appropriate data center for each tool. This will restrict business operations and result in higher operation cost. What about executive overreach? Section 36 of the DPDP Act, read in conjunction with Rule 22, empowers union government through the designated authorized persons to demand any information from the data fiduciary or intermediary entities processing personal data in the interest of Indian sovereignty, integrity, or national security. Sovereignty, integrity, or national security. Experts have cautioned that such sweeping discretionary powers are susceptible to misuse, potentially enabling surveillance or the suppression of dissent. Additionally, these provisions could compel social media intermediaries uh, to compromise and end encryption of messages, a concern raised by Meta owned WhatsApp last year. In its challenge to information technology intermediary guidelines and technological digital media ethics code rules 21. Rule 22 prohibits companies from disclosing information about such government demands if doing so could prejudicially affect the sovereignty and integrity of India or the security of the state. Apar Gupta, advocate and founder of the Internet Freedom Foundation, told The Hindu that the provision stands in stark contrast to the recommendations of the group of experts on privacy headed by Justice retired A.P. Shah in 2012. The committee categorically recommended that individuals subject to interception should be notified. There is ample evidence of interception orders being misused by police departments under political influence. This provision effectively creates a giant backdoor for government to requisition information without any checks or balances. Mr. Bharti agreed, highlighting the absence of adequate restraints on the government. The government should consider adopting safeguards akin to those under the Information Technology Act to ensure that citizens are not left unaware of the nature and extent of data requested by the government from data fiduciaries. Such expensive government discretion could also hinder commercial interests. Data localization refers to measures that restrict the flow of data within a jurisdiction's borders. While the DPDP Act permits government to limit personal data transfer, it confines such restrictions to specific notified countries. Section 36 of the DPDP Act, read in conjunction with the Rule 22, empowers the Union government through the designated authorized person to demand any information from a data fiduciary or intermediary. The Union government is currently soliciting feedback on the draft rules through a fiduciary framework that effectively precludes both public disclosure and submission of counter comments. What is the status of Smart Cities mission? What is the implementation? Why did the implementation of smart cities bypass local government and depend on special purpose vehicles? Why? What has happened to the mission in Shimla? Almost a decade has passed since the Indian government announced concept of smart cities as new lighthouses of urbanization. The June 2015 announcement of 100 smart cities aimed to create models of urban development. Now these lighthouses of urbanity have now been relegated to the annals of India's urbanization history. What went wrong with the smart cities? The smart city initiative was based on the Internet of Things, a framework that works well in advanced capitalist countries where basic utilities are already in place. In contrast, in India, where basic services are still out of reach for many, smart cities essentially means providing fundamental amenities to residents. The plan included two key components: pan-city proposals, which included IT-enabled services like mobility and waste management, and area-based development which was restricted to specific zones within the city, focusing on retrofitting, redevelopment, and greenfield projects. Additionally, governance of these projects bypassed local governments, relying instead on special purpose vehicles registered under the Companies Act and managed by like private companies. City councils were excluded based on the assumption that private company like structures could deliver better results. Shimla was not included in the initial list of smart cities. However, after legal challenges posed by Shimla in the Himachal Pradesh High Court, Shimla was also granted Smart City tag. Shimla's Smart City plan adhered to guidelines including pan city initiatives and area based development projects. The city has proposed a mix of retrofit and redevelopment projects within the ABD. The retrofit project has targeted improving citywide pedestrian crossings, vehicular mobility on circular roads, and three transport corridors in addition to underground ducting and parking provision. Additional features were also added that included eco-adventure tourism and water security through stormwater and spring water management. A total of 244 acres of land was supposed to be retrofitted. Redevelopment projects focused on Lower Bazaar, Ganj Bazaar, and Krishna Nagar. The aim was to replace